For decades, modern agriculture depended on fertilizing nitrates mined out of a South American desert. These mines were the world's only such sources of nitrates, and so valuable that 3 countries went to war over them. These nitrate riches, monopolized by foreigners, were wiped away thanks to one of the most famous chemical processes in history. But it took longer than you think. In this video, the glorious nitrates mining boom, the countries who bled for it, the men who monopolized it, and the technologies that ended it. The Atacama Desert is the world's driest non-polar desert, getting about 0.6 inches of precipitation each year. This is because it sits between 2 massive mountain ranges, the Andes and the Chilean Coast Range. Both are high enough to keep rain clouds from reaching the desert. There is probably more I can say about that, but that's the main reason. The landscape is so otherworldly, they often use it as a stand-in for Mars. And there we have these deposits of nitrates. The formal name is nitratine, but can also be called Chilean saltpeter. Nitrates are salts containing nitrogen in the form of NO3. All plants and animals need nitrogen, but 79% of the world's nitrogen is in the air. In the air, nitrogen is inert and cannot be biologically used except by a few special bacteria. So we attach another atom to that nitrogen and turn it into a compound, thereby quote-unquote fixing it. Only then we can use it. Such deposits can also be found in Egypt, Mexico, and South Africa, but the Atacama is the world's only known concentrated source of fixed nitrates. Why? In part because nitrates are quite water-soluble, and normally the rain causes them to melt and drain away. So the desert's hyperaridity helps retain the nitrates over thousands of years. Yet the actual source of the nitrates remained a mystery for a long time. Bacteria, bird guano, buried magma oxidizing nitrogen gases, aliens, ancient plants. There seems to be some iodine on the nitrates, so maybe it's seaweed? Per the work of Ji Hye-seo in Purdue University, chemical analysis of soil samples from these deposits imply that they come from the sky, just as Lex Luthor once said. Lightning in the sky provides enough energy to break the triple nitrogen bonds of atmospheric nitrogen, creating free nitrogen. The free nitrogen reacts with free oxygen in the air to create nitrogen dioxide, and the presence of such oxygen in the soil samples was a hint to this. And that in turn reacts with reactive molecules in the air called hydroxyl radicals to create nitric acid. That acid finally settles on the ground via gravity. Sounds as good a theory to me as any, beats ancient aliens anyway. It is likely that humanity has known about these nitrates since antiquity. For example, they were probably mined to make gunpowder during the Spanish-American Wars of Independence. But nitrate mining as a commercial enterprise began in 1826 with the work of Hector Baca, a Frenchman in what was then the Peruvian province of Tarapacá. The nitrates are irregularly placed, anywhere from 10 to 60 miles from the coast and between 1 to 12 feet beneath the surface soil. To get at them, workers first drill holes to bring up samples from the caliche, the chief nitrate-bearing layer. If the samples are good, then they dynamite a trench, scattering rocks all around. Men then collect the rocks, break them up with sledgehammers, and sort them by hand by nitrate purity. All of this under grueling outside conditions of 40 degrees Celsius heat. To purify the nitrates, the industry employs what is known as the Shanks method. The rocks are brought to factories where they're boiled down for 20 hours. The resulting liquid is left out to dry and crystallize. We end up with 98% pure nitrate crystals to be packed into bags and sold to agricultural interests in Europe and other places abroad as fertilizer for sugar beets and other crops. As implied, these nitrates can also be used to make explosives, making their reliable supply a keenly watched topic by national governments. The majority of these nitrates deposits once belonged to Peru and Bolivia, but were then acquired by Chile. As mentioned earlier, the first commercial fields were in the Tarapacá province within Peru. With Peru having banned slavery in 1854, the Peruvians imported tens of thousands of Chinese laborers to work the fields as indentured servants. But the discovery motivated a search for more deposits, leading to a new field discovered in the city and province of Antofagasta, the northern portion of what was part of Bolivia. In 1860, a Chilean established the Antofagasta Nitrate Company, or CSFA, and received a concession from Bolivia to exploit these deposits. They raised British money and started digging, gaining opulent profits as a result. The Peruvian government was in search of new export revenues after the collapse of their once fruitful guano industry in the 1860s. So in the 1870s, they nationalized their nitrate fields, intending to tap a future bonanza. Then in 1879, the Bolivians imposed a tax on CSFA in violation of a recently concluded treaty. As they did this, they signed a secret military treaty alliance with the Bolivians. CSFA refused to pay the tax, seeing it as a Bolivian move to displace Chileans, and the Bolivians seized the company with the intention of auctioning off its assets. On the day the Bolivians were to do that auction, Chile sent 2,000 troops to seize the city. What followed was the War of the Pacific, a momentous event in the histories of all three countries. The war lasted for over 4 years, with the Chileans' naval edge eventually allowing them to invade and occupy the Peruvian capital of Lima. This led Chile and Peru to sign a peace settlement in 1883, with Peru ceding the Tarapacá province and its nitrate fields. A year later, Chile and Bolivia signed a truce. A peace settlement would not come for another 20 years, in which Chile won effective control of the northern part of the Antofagasta province, and in the process, landlocking Bolivia. There's great dispute over the three countries' intentions in starting this war, and who or what is to blame. The Peruvians and Bolivians believe that Chilean business greed and imperialist aggressions sparked the war. Contemporary observers, particularly in the United States, thought the war was motivated behind the scenes by the British, whose money initially funded the CSFA. And the Chileans, having won, have said little other than to emphasize the justice of their cause. I refer you to the Wikipedia article, which is very detailed. No matter the perspective, however, it is widely agreed that the war was fought over these fields, and in the end the Chileans won control of all the known nitrates fields in the western coast of South America. Chileans spilled blood for these fields, yet for some time its riches were funneled out of the country. After the war, the CSFA continued operating as before, so British capital was already profiting handsomely in the once Bolivian side of the nitrates fields. What happened in the Tarapacá was a bit more wild. When the Peruvians nationalized their nitrates industry before the war, they could not raise the cash to buy out the former owners, so instead they issued state certificates, more like bonds, as compensation. Then in 1881, the Chileans announced that they would honor those Peruvian certificates. Why would they do this? Well, they had captured the land, but not yet won the war. It wouldn't end for another 2 years, so they were anxious to solidify their tenuous grip on the locale. Enter John Thomas North. North was born in England. He became moderately wealthy by supplying the port city of Iquique with water. In 1881, prior to Chile's announcement, he and his business partner traveled to Lima and bought up the certificates for the best factories. It's not clear whether he knew that Chile was going to honor the Peruvian certificates, but he certainly knew which factories were the good ones. He bought the certificates for as low as 50% on the dollar, eventually controlling 71% of industry capacity. North then returned to London and used the certificates to form an IPO, the Liverpool Nitrate Company, becoming exorbitantly wealthy as a result. They called him the Nitrate King. North funneled his nitrate wealth into a life of luxury in Britain, and like any good monopolist, he used his economic and legal powers to block competition to his nitrates empire. He also funneled Chilean money to a bunch of other questionable speculative ventures like Australian gold mines, Egyptian tramways, and perhaps worst of all, King Leopold II's cruel rubber empire in Belgian Congo. John North's nitrate empire was a massive lost development opportunity for Chile because all booms eventually end. Scientists recognized early on that it did not make sense for the world's agriculture to rely so heavily on a desert in Chile. In 1898, Sir William Crookes, an English chemist and physicist, who invented one of the precursors of the vacuum tube, made a big public speech regarding the nitrates issue. He said that the desert supplies will not last forever, just like the bird guanos of Peru, and so without a synthetic source of fixed nitrogen, the world's food supply will fail and people will all go hungry. Crookes deliberately amped up his speech for maximum publicity, and he backed it with a large publicity campaign, including pamphlets. I guess nowadays we'd call it clickbait. And for that reason, we most remember it in scientific history, but the problem had been discussed at least a decade earlier. Fortunately, by the late 1800s, we knew of processes that can produce fixed nitrogen at scale. One key such process was coal gasification, which turns coal into coal gas via heat and pressure. Gasification also produces ammonia gas as a byproduct, which can potentially be used to make fertilizers if it were to be put in a more practical form. In 1890, the German-English chemist Ludwig Mohn showed a way to extend the old coal gasification method to produce ammonium sulfate, a solid and stable form of ammonia using sulfuric acid. Along the way, Mohn also produced Mohn gas, a cheap coal gas used for a long time in Britain to heat homes. Then in 1900, German scientists captured nitrogen from the air by reacting it with calcium carbide at high heat to create a chemical known as calcium cyanamide or nitrolime. We know this as the Frank-Caro process today, after Adolf Frank and Nicodème Caro, and was one of the first major synthetic nitrogen processes to be commercialized at scale. Nitrolime is still used widely today as a potent 2-in-1 fertilizer and pesticide. Imperial Japan licensed the Frank-Caro process, creating one of its early zaibatsu called Nichitsu. In 1905, Christian Birkeland and Sam Eide of Norway introduced a process of fixing nitrogen by passing air through an electric arc. Like as with the lightning bolts we talked about earlier, the arc splits the bonds of the nitrogen in the air. The free nitrogen then reacts with free oxygen to make nitrogen dioxide. We can then mix that with water and calcium hydroxide to make Norwegian saltpeter. It was sold by Norsk Hydro, the aluminium and hydropower company. So we had these two very good industrial processes for fixing nitrogen to make synthetic fertilizers. The issue, however, with the Frank-Caro and Birkeland-Ide processes was that they were energy intensive. Factories had to be collated with hydropower stations, and this restrained their economic competitiveness against Chilean saltpeter. Then in 1909, the Haber-Bosch process, launcher of 1,000 Today I Learned Reddit posts. Haber-Bosch directly produced ammonium at high temperature and pressure, using finely ground metal iron powder as a catalyst. It used no electricity and drastically less overall power than the old ways. Haber-Bosch, though still revolutionary, was not a genius bolt from the blue, but rather the most economically successful of a series of inventions of the time, with a particular advantage in labor and energy efficiency. Despite the revolutionary arrival of energy-saving, industrial-scale nitrogen fixation, the German Empire remained one of Chile's better customers, accounting for a third of total sales in 1913. This was because small farmers were used to Chilean saltpeter. They widely perceived it to be superior to synthetics and did not want to switch. Think margarine versus butter. In 1913, artificial fertilizers made up just 16% of the nitrogen put into the soil. The government had to put out marketing materials to farmers to try to get them to adopt synthetics. When war broke out in 1914, Germany faced a sea blockade that immediately ended its access to Chilean saltpeter. The German government thus seized all that was left within its borders for producing weaponry. But the ruinous Butcherfest, that was the first Battle of the Marne in September 1914, made it clear that Germany was going to need a lot more weapons, corresponding to a 20-fold increase of nitrate production. They rapidly scaled up all forms of synthetic nitrogen processing, including the Frank-Caro and Haber-Bosch processes. Such wartime capacity would eventually cause a ruinous market situation after all the fighting ended. For the Chileans, the war marked the beginning of the end for their nitrates industry. By now, the Chilean government had become terribly dependent on the saltpeter industry through a 30 to 70% export tax that yielded an estimated $25 to $35 million a year in 1930 dollars. It also employed 50,000 workers, and since the work was in the barren north, unemployed workers had little alternative for jobs and no easy way to leave. In 1914, 91 nitrates factories had to close when the Germans were cut off, but the industry did not die right then, as 97% of their exports shifted to the United States. The war also temporarily prevented the worldwide dissemination of the Haber-Bosch process and its synthetic ammonia production. But soon after the armistice in 1919, the Germans started exporting their excess capacity, sending the market into an oversupply situation. The Chileans scaled down their production, receiving money from the government to stave them through hard times. In 1919 and 1921, the industry banded together into a cartel, the Chilean Nitrate Producers Association. The cartel then started setting prices in the market with supply quotas, much to the government's grumbling from the lack of export taxes. The cartel fell apart in 1927. In steps the Guggenheim Brothers Company, run by brothers Murray and Sol Guggenheim. The family had become extremely wealthy from mining investments and was buying up depressed value mines in the wake of the war. Their chief metallurgist had pioneered a new process for extracting the Chilean nitrates from the ore, cutting costs 40% by using centrifuges in concrete tanks. Steam-powered and attached to a railway, the system was quite efficient. The brothers in charge did not know much about fertilizers or that market, but trusted their engineer. So their company bought the crisis-engulfed Chilean nitrates companies and started building a factory. It was finished just in time to hit a depressed fertilizer market, again thanks to German oversupply. With the help of an increasingly indebted and desperate Chilean government, in 1931 the Guggenheims arranged a monopoly company called COSACH with 95% of the industry. At the industry's urgings, the government dropped its export taxes and took direct share in COSACH. COSACH technology failed successfully. It cut the cost of nitrates refinement, but also substantially cut employment. 7,000 workers can produce 70,000 tons of saltpeter, while previously, with the Shanks method, it took 9,000 workers to make just 30,000 tons. Up to 85% of the workforce lost their jobs. Shedding this much labor, most of which were single, childless men, was politically sensitive. So the Guggenheims ran even their most productive factories at middle utilization so to spread quote-unquote work around to other factories. But when American imports of Chilean nitrates crashed from $21 million to just $1.4 million, thanks to the Great Depression, COSACH collapsed too in 1933, from insolvency, violent labor riots, and political scandal over the company's creation. The venture was apparently so traumatic that the Guggenheims largely withdrew from directly running businesses to do philanthropy, museums, investments, and the LA Dodgers. COSACH's collapse marks the final end of the nitrates boom, but there is an afterlife. After the collapse, the Chilean government revived its assets as a new monopoly company called Covensa. Covensa then shook hands with the Germans and Japanese to set up a worldwide sales cartel that stabilized prices enough for industrial production to go on for a few more decades. And then, during Chile's turbulent late 1960s and early 70s, Covensa's assets were dissolved and eventually reorganized into a new company called SQM. SQM was privatized and has since seen success as one of the beneficiaries of the new age lithium battery boom. Good for them. And hopefully this time, the money stays in Chile. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, sign up for the Patreon, and I'll see you guys next time.